What is the state of the Transitional Security Arrangement between the government and the SPLM-AIO? And what is the present situation in the country due to political disagreements? Join us as we discuss this and more only on Beyond the Headlines. Our guest on the program is Mr. Edmund Yakani, the Executive Director of Community Empowerment for Progress Organization. Welcome to Beyond the Headlines.
Yeah, thank you very much for welcoming me for this particular session.
It is good to have you on. There's been, for the past week, a significant amount of political developments that have taken place within the country. What is the update on the present situation in Juba following the involvement of Sudan, a chair of IGAD, in the political disagreements between the government and the SPLM-AIO?
Thank you very much. Maybe I can start with the very breaking news that at least the SPLM-IG or the SPLM in the government, which is described in the agreement as incumbent government, and the SPLM-IO in opposition have at least reached an agreement for resolving their disagreement on the Chapter 2 implementation, which is a security arrangement, and in particular, disagreement is on unification of the command structure. By unification of the command structure, I refer to the parties that fought and reached an agreement, the revitalized agreement, which part of the agreement is Chapter 2, they have to get unified to become a national army. So for them to get unified to become a national army, then it means during the days of the war, their institutional structure also have to be unified. And unification of the command structure is very important in implementing Chapter 2. Actually, it is a corner foundation of implementing all the provisions in Chapter 2. Why? Because if you don't unify the command structure, even if you graduate a unified force with an unified command structure, it's going to be problematic, because the command structure defines the centralization of decision and military or security and defense instructions that comes from one center, and this center operates through a unified system. That means you will not have anybody in the command structure that pay allegiance to South Sudan People's Defense Force, or pay allegiance to SPLIO, or pay allegiance to the military section of SOA. So you start having one particular person in the command structure that pay allegiance to the constitution-defined security and defense institution. And of course, what we have militarily as an official defined state institution in the military is the South Sudan People's Defense Force. So you need to have one commander-in-chief for South Sudan Defense Force, one chief of staff, and the rest of the structures. So there'll be no anybody saying, I'm chief of staff for SPLA-IO forces or for SOA forces. So that is a milestone that is very important, that at least today, through the mediation of Sudan, as you said, as a grantor to the revitalized agreement, but also at the same time as a chair of IGAD, they were able to press our leaders, in particular, His Excellency the President and First Vice President, whom have a deep mistrust and lack of confidence of working together. They were able to be pursued by Sudan to reach a consensus on the unification of the command structure through a formula of responsibility sharing of 60 versus 40. So 60 refer to the incumbent government or SPLM in the government, and then 40 refer to opposition, and opposition will be shared between SPLIO and SOA. And obviously, between SPLIO and SOA, they have to share per the defined percentage in the responsibility sharing in Chapter 1, which SPLIO take 27% of the 40, and SOA take 10% of the 40. So also likely we may see another negotiation between SPLIO and SOA in sharing their 40%. We hope that it will not be another factor of dragging their feet in unifying the command structure. So that's what I'd like to say. So while generally the public fear have reduced, I don't say the public fear is off, the public fear have reduced, at least because since for the last 5 days, we have never seen any active military confrontation between the SSPDF and the SPLIO or the defector of SPLIO that pay allegiance under His Excellency the President fighting the SPLA-IO under Dr. Riek Machar. We have not yet seen that clashes. So at least that is a bit of a better improvement. But still in Juba town, from 8 p.m. always we see deployment of uniformed men, mainly military and national security officers, around the area of the State House where His Excellency the President and then Vice President Waniiga and First Vice President Riek Machar are living. So the roads that link the three leaders, President, First Vice President, and Vice President Waniiga, their roads are always from 8 p.m. blocked by uniformed guys. So that still raises a panic. And that's why you can see IO still was saying, still as a deployment of uniformed people towards the house of His Excellency First Vice President. But I hope that with this agreement that they have signed some few hours ago, that should normalize the situation. And we hope that tomorrow, the streets of Juba from 8 p.m. will be free of deployment of uniformed people. We are hoping for the best.
The summary of the agreement reached by the parties for the command structure of the unified forces is as follows. Appointment of the opposition generals into unified command structure within this week. Graduation of unified forces within 2 months. Return of the opposition into the mechanisms. Abide by ceasefire and cessation of hostilities agreements. No party should encourage, facilitate, or motivate defections to either side. Immediate cease of media propaganda and hostilities. Prepare for phase 2 within 1 month. Build trust among the presidency. After the signing of the guidelines to implement Chapter 2 on the security arrangement, the mining minister, Martin Gama Abucha, stated the following.
And today we have made a milestone in that, and we have agreed and we have signed an understanding that it shall be moved forward. Most important is not only the signing, but the implementation of these articles. We must implement what we say. The people of South Sudan expect us to do that. We all must recognize peace. The guns must go down. The silence of the guns is most important to peace. We cannot continue to fight when we are talking peace in Juba.
During our interview last week, you had mentioned that you'd work to engage Vice President Rebecca Nyandeng-Demabior to urge the leaders to come to a consensus and quell the disagreements that they are now facing. What was your engagement with Madame Rebecca Nyandeng-Demabior?
We interacted, we communicated through several sources. Actually, she played a big role in de-escalating the tension between His Excellency President and First Vice President. And now, by history, she's a key player. She's a mother of the nation, being a wife of His Excellency First Vice President of Sudan, Dr. John Garang Mabiro, who is a founder of SPLM and SPLM. So from that background, she have a big role to play, and then she really as a link between the current leaders, being His Excellency the President and His Excellency First Vice President. So she played a big role in de-escalating the tension, and I like to take this opportunity to appreciate her for her role. She has played really a very big role in ensuring that the two have not returned to war, because war is a big. But also another person who have played a big, good, important role is His Excellency Vice President Taban Deng and Abdul Bagi Ai. All the vice president who have reached out to them to lobby them as a national actors that can diffuse the tension between His Excellency President and his First Vice President. So all of them play an effective role in this escalating the tension. And also they play a big role in reaching out to Sudan, because we communicate to them to reach out to Sudan to make sure that Sudan come fully and Sudan come effectively. And I think that succeeded.
It seems with the negative developments in South Sudan, the country is now on the spotlight and has attention of the regional as well as the global community. What are your thoughts on this particular development?
This particular issue is that the tension and the clashes between His Excellency President Salva Kiir and his First Vice President, it become a historical issue in the modern history of South Sudan, because it seems the two have high deficit in trust and confidence of working together. The whole world is aware that the two players, His Excellency President and First Vice President, have high deficit in trust and confidence. In the history, people are aware that revolutionaries, whenever they found a country as an independent country, they have tendency that the transfer of power from one individual to another individual or from one party to another party is normally not transferred in a peaceful and honorable manner. And the region we're living in, you see how revolutionaries behave. You have seen the struggle in Sudan, the struggle in Uganda. Normally you find that revolutionaries own the country and the state, and among themselves they disagree over the formula of how to transfer power from one of their comrades to another comrade or from one party to another party. Always it's in dispute. So I think the biggest challenge is that South Sudan is the newest country in the world that could have learned from the mistakes of other countries and could have applied democracy in a better manner. That people can say this is a model case of a newest independent country in the world. But unfortunately, we're starting from square one where other countries have messed, where as if we are a country that got independence in either in 50s or 60s, while we get our independence in 20 years. So that is a problem that have drawn regional and international attention. But besides that also, if you look at the global economical community, if you talk of World Bank and IMF, they have recently been making positive statements around public finance reforms in South Sudan. And their IMF is giving more loans, and IMF say their first loan was properly used. So people are wondering in the world, if IMF say in South Sudan, there's improvement in the financial management systems and they're giving more loans, then why politically we are having a very contradicting messages that the leaders are unable to transition the country from violence to peace? What does that mean economically in a military political governance system? So I think that also have drawn a lot of attention of huge scholars and journalists who are working around the economic sector in a post-conflict situation. They might have brought a lot of attention. And I think that also have attention to investment companies that have contributed to bring South Sudan to the front light of the region and the global community.
At a press conference held last week, President Salva Kiir called on the National Security Services to declassify information that alleges Dr. Riek Machar, Taban Dengai, and others were involved in an attempted coup to topple the government back in 2013. Here is what the president stated.
We need transparency on the root causes of the conflict. It is for this reason that I am directing the National Security Service and its partner, the BRL law firm, to declassify all information about the conflict's genesis in their possessions.
With the information now released, what impact will it have on building confidence among the leaders? Since we have some of the vice presidents like Riek Machar as well as Taban Dengai are being accused directly for getting involved in the attempted coup. Also, will the information change the narrative that is quite globally known that there were no attempts to topple the government?
In regard to this report, I don't know what's the interest. I will describe it is an information that is released in the wrong time, and it have missed its intended purpose of why it's written. We hope that this report could have come in the early days of 2013, and specifically when we have a court hearing in Juba under the judiciary of South Sudan, where quite a number of leaders that you have mentioned who have been accused of plotting a coup, and I think some of them are now allies of the president. They were in the court for trial, and the South Sudan domestic legal institution, the judiciary, the Supreme Court, have dismissed the attempt of coup, and they free the suspect to be free of accusation. Besides that, AU Commission of Inquiry have also justified in their investigation under the leadership of former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, have said also they couldn't find any evidence or clear information as an attempted coup. But now this information come out and justify that as a coup. I think one is that this information, this particular report, I wish could have not been released because its implication is one, it reminds those who have become allies of the president about how the president viewed them. They are viewed as people who are actually attempting to remove him from power through a coup, though they are allies right now to the president, like Vice President Taban Deng, and you can count others of them. So I think that report is a reminder of that particular moment. It widened the trust and confidence between His Excellency the President and the allies that have shifted by then under IO, Dr. Riek Machar, which later become IO for Peace under Vice President Taban Deng. But I think between him and Riek Machar, whether this report is out or this report is not out, the level of trust and lack of confidence among them is high before this report. And we have seen its indication in terms of the political will to deliver the agreement, although they too have a very high level of mistrust and confidence in implementing the agreement. So this report have no huge impact in changing the narrative because already the moment they are in is that the level of trust and confidence is very high. But unfortunately, this report have come in a moment that also it reminds others who are allies to the president that they are still being viewed as people who are plotting coup, though they are allies to the president. And that may have impact in the level of relations in terms of being allies, being close friends, that may have an impact on them. But my message is that this particular report may not have big impact on the narrative of the situation we're in now because already it found the tension between the incumbent government and the SPLM is very high, and between His Excellency President and his first Vice President is very high. And if you remember, 2 days ago, President have said that he hope Riek will demonstrate a will to the Sudanese proposal on unification of the forces, and which in particular, unification of the command, which today they have reached. So already send the signals that he's really distrusting that his Vice President, first Vice President Dr. Riek Machar may not have the will to give in for the proposal that were proposed by Sudan on unification of the command. And I think at least today they have reached a deal over that. But I think the main problem for me is that this report will not have a big impact, but also this report give sometimes, my interpretation of this report also give the enemies of the president or those who are calling for justice and accountability a clear evidence that, okay, people names were being mentioned, their voice were being taped, then the question of protection of the data become a very big issue. And if you start talking about crimes against humanity, there's a clear indication that this report may strengthen people who say there's a crime against humanity happened in the country because it's under directives of the state or under the state in terms of interpretation. Of course, Stephen, as a British lawyer, have mentioned with his vast experience in working in similar situation that there's a coup and he wished that AU and UN should apologize to the country and specifically the government of South Sudan for denying coup, but those are all subject for interpretation. But I think also this report will raise up some issues with regard to transitional justice. As you're aware that in the same press conference, His Excellency President have instructed the Minister of Justice to launch the public consultation on enactment of the legislation for forming the Commission of National Healing, Truth, and Reconciliation. And on Tuesday, President will officially launch this particular process. And I think this particular report, it aids people who want to see justice and accountability to build up a lot of concerns around the process of transitional justice in the country. So I think, yes, it was not a good report to be released at this particular time, but also it have its advantage in strengthening the call for justice and accountability in terms of data that may strengthen people's opinion on what type of justice and accountability they want to see. This report might have created a new trend in terms of the perspective or perception of the citizen towards transitional justice. I think that, for me, will be the interpretation of the report.
While Sudan chairs IGAD, Ethiopia chairs the Ceasefire and Transitional Security Arrangements Monitoring and Verification Mechanism, abbreviated as CITESAM MVM. Also, it is important to note that CITESAM MVM is mandated to monitor compliance by the signatory parties and armed groups, either under their control or invited to support them, to the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan, ARCAS signed in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in September 2018. CITESAM MVM monitors the signatory parties through its monitoring and verification teams MVTs located in 9 of the most conflict-affected areas of South Sudan. Why has Ethiopia remained silent as it chairs such an important institution?
Ethiopia was the broker of the 2015 agreement, which was revitalized in 2018 as a chair of IGAD. But when we are implementing the 2018 peace agreement, Ethiopia fall into its own internal crisis between the government and then the Tigray. Of course, we're all aware that has weakened Ethiopia's strengths in playing game in regional peace and security issues. So Ethiopia have went quiet. Though Ethiopia sit at Citizen as a chair, and even actually Sudan being a chair of IGAD, at the same time, Sudan also the deputy of Citizen. So Sudan deputizing Citizen, becoming more active than the chair, that chair Citizen, which is Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is a chair of Citizen. So I think based on these particular situations that have been developing in the country, Ethiopia have no interest because of its own internal crisis that it's facing. But of latest, actually, the last 2 days, Ethiopian Minister of Defense is in the country. He is part and parcel of the witness, the SPLA, IO, and the SSPDF on the unification of the command structure. So Ethiopian Minister of Defense is in country. So for Ethiopia, it's of its regional interest to see that the peace and stability process in South Sudan is part and parcel of Ethiopian interest because it's a question of regional security and regional peace. So Ethiopia have to be concerned, and specifically when Sudan becoming active, and remember, when Sudan is becoming active, likely you can't isolate Egypt. Egypt is not part of IGAD, but Egypt may become more influential in the transformation of South Sudan from violence to peace because also it have a regional interest of Egypt. And remember, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt have a leftover issues of the dam, resource dam in the Blue Nile. So this disputed dam in the Blue Nile, which was constructed by Ethiopia, it has a tension between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. So of latest, Ethiopia feel it is of its regional interest to come and to be part and parcel of the process that leads to an agreement on the unification of the command structure, because command structure of security and defense in South Sudan may have a direct implications or regional implications on Ethiopian regional peace and security agenda. So Ethiopia becoming more active. They came and the Minister of Defense attended.
You had mentioned during our last interview that Uganda, as a member of IGAD, planned on sending a delegation to Juba to meet with the leadership. What is the position of Uganda in the recent escalation of confrontation between the parties?
Of course, Uganda took the position of behind the curtains diplomacy. So they don't want to be in the front of the curtains. And they've been moving in between Juba and Kampala. And officially what Uganda have did is that one of a senior leader of Uganda in the security sector have made a statement of urging His Excellency President Salva and His Excellency First Vice President Dr. Riek Machar to talk. That at least has come out publicly from Uganda, and that after a lot of lobby and push with the Ugandan mission in Juba to ensure that Uganda have a public statement. So that's a public statement which was made 1 day ago, and then today we see our leaders reaching an agreement. That means behind the curtains, Uganda has been active and been pushing also. Of course, Uganda gave Sudan the opportunity as a chair of IGAD to drive their process. So I'm quite sure Uganda and Sudan might have reached consensus. And if you remember, a week ago, Sudanese President El Burhan went to Kampala and met with Museveni, and he passed through Juba, and where they have come with this proposal of the unification of the structure of command. I think that is where Uganda is playing a behind curtain role. So Uganda might have been active, especially when they made a statement with the senior leader asking His Excellency President and First Vice President to have face-to-face meeting.
Now, with the ongoing talks on the transitional security arrangements taking place, and with the issue of military defections being of concern, is there any suggestions on how to deal with this and ensure that we don't fall back?
Obviously, the agreement which was reached today partly is focusing on how to sanction defections. But the parties were silent on issue of defections because they may interpret defections as it's an individual interest or internal crisis of one of them, then the members of the other party may decide to defect to the other. But I think defection is something that needs to be sanctioned. And I wish that defections should be sanctioned, because if defection is not sanctioned now, even this signed agreement that we have seen today may not be implemented, because in South Sudan, we have our old history. By then, when we're in Sudan, we have this tendency of where agreements are signed and they are dishonored the following day. So we are excellent in signing agreements, but we're very poor in implementing them. And normally they're always beautiful agreements. So the tendency of signing agreements and dishonoring them the next day may happen to this agreement if defections are not sanctioned, because defection may undermine the spirit of unifying the defense and the security sector. So for me, one of the biggest things we want to see in terms of translation of this agreement, which they have reached today, is a question of sanctioning defections, and specifically the incumbent government in terms of South Sudan People's Defense Force have to stand firm and discourage defections of members of IO, whatever internal crisis they are. They should be facing certain process that does not give them the mandate to undermine or to fight their counterparts on being, because they have changed the allegiance from SPLM to SSPDF or from one party to another.
This coming Tuesday, April 5th, the President will launch an official public consultation on the transitional justice legislation, as you had mentioned. This is in light of recent developments which have offered an opportunity for the implementation of Chapter 5 on the transitional justice. Can you address this?
Yes, this Chapter 5 is one of the chapters that, when it was signed, is described and specified by the incumbent government as an agenda of the international community for using accountability and justice as a way of undermining political transition of power from one party to another peacefully, which I don't agree with that particular notion. But Chapter 5 is one of the feared chapter among the political elites in the country, and specifically with the instrument of the hybrid court that was enshrined in Chapter 5 as one of the instruments for transitional justice. But when the president addressed the nation recently, the president have said he wants to tell the international and the regional community that the government is not afraid of making sure that justice and accountability prevail under Chapter 5 in terms of transitional justice. So he instructed the Ministry of Justice to roll out the transitional justice, and in particular, two mechanisms: Commission for National Healing, Reconciliation, and Truth, which need to be enacted by a domestic legislation, and one mechanism is called Compensation and Reparation Authority, also that need a national legislation through our parliament, which was reconstituted recently. So President have instructed the Ministry of Justice to carry out public consultation on how they want to see these two legislation to be enacted, and these two legislation will bring the two institutions for existence: Commission for Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation, and then Reparation and Compensation Authority. But of course, hybrid court is one of the mechanisms. In terms of holistic approach for transitional justice, President have said he will ask the Ministry of Justice to continue dialogue with AU, because hybrid court being entrusted to African Union to be one of the drivers or one of the implementing agent of a hybrid court. That the Ministry of Justice and the government should continue dialogue with AU for the establishment of the hybrid court, and he have the will to ensure that the hybrid court exists. So for me, that is how it triggers. That's the trigger where I had made the president justify that under his leadership, justice and accountability, he can't compromise with them. So on Tuesday, President will launch this process officially. But of course, I have an opinion. If it to go for public consultation on matters of transitional justice, if you don't prevail or if you don't allow a free civic space, then that's a problem. If you don't allow freedom of expression, that's going to be a problem. If you don't allow freedom of assembly and association, that's going to be a problem. So I wish that during the president address in launching the transitional justice process, he should also declare and instruct all state agencies to observe civic space, to observe freedom of expression, to observe free speech, free media, freedom of assembly and association. Without these values, public consultation to bring up information that will inform the content of the legislation that will establish the institution of the transitional justice is going to be problematic. And specifically where we have deep-rooted wounds that are in our hearts of what we have seen in 2013 and 2016 violence, where gross human rights violations were really committed. So the government needs to be ready that they will allow citizens to speak up their mind, and they will pinpoint some individuals. So the leaders who have power, who have authority, need to have culture of tolerance to listen to the voice of the citizens, because transitional justice is not a soft game. It's a game of swallowing the bitter pill. So I wish that the government is ready to swallow the bitter pills during consultation. Otherwise, if the government want to use restriction of civic space and freedom of expression, not to allow citizens to speak out their mind, then the consultation are not going to be fruitful and it's not going to win the trust and confidence of the citizens.
What is the assurance this time that President Salva Kiir and Dr. Riek Machar will generally implement the peace agreement, since we are left with 9 months until the peace deal comes to an end?
You know, if the two, His Excellency President and His Excellency First Vice President, if they can regain trust and confidence, I don't use the word rebuilding. I don't think they need to rebuild trust and confidence. If they can regain trust and confidence for working together as a partners to agree on a successful political transitional process in which we'll end up with elections where citizens will decide to vote, we'll have a successful transitioning. But what we have seen in the past 2 or 3 years, they struggling to implement the peace agreement or transition the country from the current situation where we are to peace through an implemented peace agreement. If they continue the same spirit that we have seen in the last 2 years, where there's a deficit in trust and confidence, even this agreement which was signed some few hours ago, will not see any different change of attitudes that will make us impressed or will make us happy that now we're in a successful pathway of moving from the situation we're in to peace and stability. So everything depends on His Excellency President and First Vice President to change their political attitudes, to accept the reality that whether they like it, they don't like it, they have the primary responsibility for successful transitioning of South Sudan from the situation we are now to a peaceful and stable situation, because history will remember them. I'm quite sure they are interested to see their names are written to the books of history with successful performance, not performance of being people who have committed human rights, people who have led the country, fail democratic governance. I think they need to really change their political attitudes in order to succeed in transitioning the country from the situation where we are now to a better situation.
Our guest on the program has been Mr. Edmund Yakani, the Executive Director of Community Empowerment for Progress Organization. Thank you for joining me here on Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you very much.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube page at Sunrise Media.